For the past few days since I've arrived in Australia, I've talked with so many people, old and young, and from various professions and backgrounds. And the issue of Palestine is clearly something that people associate with and are feeling quite deeply, just like the situation is in the UK, and I would also venture a guess and say in the United States and across Europe and the like. From your perspective, when the issue of Palestine is mentioned, and obviously now we're beyond 1 year of a genocide committed in Gaza, what does that actually mean? Because notably, the kind of the community, whether it be Arab or Muslim, I mean, particularly the Arab community, they're mainly from the Levant. They're mainly from Lebanon, from Palestine, from Syria. That's what I observe. But when you talk about Palestine, when Palestine is mentioned, how does that figure within the psyche of the Australian Muslim community?
I think the past year has been an awakening moment for the Australian Muslim community in particular, in that, you know, it's been a line in the sand. For too long, we have witnessed occupation, blockades, apartheid, oppression, and so forth. But it's almost been lip service, I think, for many. And as difficult as the last year, the circumstances have been in terms of, the unprecedented extent of loss of life, destruction, and so forth, it was as if the community needed to witness that, to be shaken enough, to take proactive measures, and to impart change in how it is that they even think about Palestine. And you come to realise that it's actually not an issue that's exclusive and limited to the Australian Muslim community. We're having, we've got so much solidarity out there from broader communities. The allyship that we're forming with other communities has been phenomenal. Unfortunately, at times that tends to take the back stage, and we are only confronted with, the pro-Zionist, Israeli propaganda that we often witness. But as an Australian Muslim community, I think it's been it's a situation where it's as if they're going to sort of be awakened forever and say, not going to let this happen again.
But what's the nature of that kind of kinship with Palestine? Is it through the political lens? Is it entirely humanitarian? Is it to do with ethnicity, with that kind of familial connection? What kind of relationship is it within the Australian Muslim community? I'm going to talk in a little bit about wider society, but from the Australian Muslim community, where does Palestine figure? On what kind of level?
It is multifaceted. One of it is faith, right? Whether you like it or not, there is a direct link and tie between Muslims. There is this direct, I guess, connection between absolutely every Muslim, not just in Australia, globally, to Palestine. It is a holy land, and it is something that sits very deep within every Muslim who wishes to, or who understands history and context. That's one. It is also cultural. It is also political, because for the very first time we are coming to see that, unfortunately, having been born and raised here, considering ourselves never, no less than as Australian as anyone else, for the first time actually there's this sense of alienation and marginalisation and so forth.
How so?
You don't, look, the deafening silence on a political level, in a sense, where our leadership here, unfortunately, who's traditionally been the best friend of Palestine, a Labor government led by Anthony Albanese, who's traditionally been at the forefront of, advocating for the rights of Palestinians, has not been as vocal as we would have expected. And this is where the disappointment and, I guess, betrayal is coming from, in a sense that, if this is the stance that the best friend of Palestine is going to take, and we saw that in the in the last few days with the statements that were released and the announcements that were released by the PM around the 1-year anniversary, where there is a complete ignoring and lack of acknowledgement at the 40+ thousand Palestinians that have been slaughtered and massacred over the last year. It almost makes you believe, question your sense of belonging as an Australian Muslim. And that's been an awakening whereby...
That's quite profound, by the way, to say that on an issue which is, let's bring it back to its essential elements, is an entirely political issue where views will invariably differ, to feel that you feel alienated because the government doesn't represent your views. That's a big statement.
Yeah. As I said, Palestine is a line in the sand. And look, we've been, in Australia, we have been through so much as a Muslim community. September 11 impacted us all here. Then you have the Cronulla riots where there was, a marginalisation of the Muslim community. Then you have situations where, there were raids and targeting of young Muslims in the wake of the ISIS, global issues that were ensuing. But for us this time round, it's been very different. And it's almost like you are being forced to suffocate your own mourning and grief, as if you have not been given permission to grieve and mourn your own, to an extent that, when the other side is putting arguments forward as to how dare Palestinians even want to hold vigils on that same day in which a genocide begun, is very demoralising. So the Australian Muslim community, added with that element of feeling marginalised, added with that element of traditionally being isolated, but also that we all also have a deep-rooted connection to Palestine. And it is, whether you like it or not, if we're talking Muslim community, it is faith-based. You cannot take that away. But
why do you think that, as you put it, someone whom basically all his public life was so positive in regards with defending the rights of Palestinians, talking of the occupation, why is it that all of a sudden that seems to absolutely not even figure? I saw the statement. It's, as you put it, it's quite shocking on several levels. But why is it? How is it possible for someone who has invested so much of his own personal career in a case and a cause, be in a position whereby it's as though it's been totally ignored?
Could a winning government perhaps change things for people, right? Again, the last 365 days have allowed us to unveil people and where their real position and true position on whether it's, local or global politics actually rests. But ultimately, one part would be that, there's no genuine care factor for the cause. It could have all just been, a political ploy to gain the votes of Muslims. And we know that as a Muslim community, we have been put through that process where we have been used and our votes have been taken for granted traditionally. Second is that there is that pressure. Unfortunately, yes, the Zionist lobby, without doubt, would have been putting and continues to put that pressure, coupled with the hijacking of media and mainstream media. That all plays a part. So ultimately, it's been a true test of, who is sincere and who is not. Anyone who is sincere as to any cause, particularly a human rights cause, is not going to sabotage that by whatever means of pressure you're going to experience. You'll stand firm and you'll stand, steadfast regardless if you are genuine about that cause.
We'll come to the politics side in a bit, but I'd like to talk more about the pro-Palestine campaign throughout Australia, outside the realms of the Australian Muslim community, in Australia as a phenomenon. And, Australia has been swept with these demonstrations, with these exhibitions of solidarity and support and sympathy and the such. How would you categorize that kind of overall reaction from the public?
It's been very inspiring. It's been heartwarming to know that there are allies out there who show solidarity for the cause regardless of race or religion, that this is not a matter that should be limited to race or religion. It's a matter of, human rights, humanity, morals and ethics, and that one day when your, potentially grandchildren are going to come and visit museums that document this genocide, and you will be asked, grandma or grandpa, what did you do during this time that you were alive, that you were on the right side of history? It's quite powerful. So we've seen, grassroots-led protests that are generally being led by, non-Muslims. I mean, obviously through and with the assistance and consultation of Palestinians and so forth, but not necessarily Muslims, and that's been very powerful. And you see a complementary role that's played within various, facets within the Australian community. So whether it's, writers coming together, whether it's academics coming together, whether it's healthcare professionals, and we're not talking Muslims or exclusively Muslims, lawyers who are against the silencing and so forth, teachers, and funnily enough, and the reason why this particular unprecedented global event, Gaza, has been impactful on every front is that every single industry is suffering some sort of a pushback because of this issue. So, in my profession as a lawyer, the daily phone calls that I receive from whether it's, workplace or employment issues around the fact that I was pulled up because I posted something pro-Palestine, was a doctor, that I put something on my LinkedIn. The extent in which silencing has infiltrated institutions, on even a department level, has been mind-blowing. And it goes to show that there's something really wrong here in that, the concerted effort to ensure that the truth does not surface.
I could definitely relate to that in terms of the British context, as well as what I hear and observe from our European neighbours, in that, there are now several sections of society that are now questioning the validity of the claim of democracy and freedoms and human rights and liberties, women's rights. It's something that the West claims to have been fighting for now for decades and achieved at a particular position, which, personally I think is detrimental, but forgetting that for a moment. But it seems all those values that were so proclaimed, in fact, my country and yours as well went to war. In 2001, 2003, we went to war, and that resulted in the death of untold numbers, all because we claimed that we wanted to secure the freedoms of women, of children, of people to have their political rights. Yet now, when this is happening, we're seeing that there is an actual, effective, under the guise of law, under the guise of security, there is a curtailing of all of that.
Selective democracy, right? And that in fact... And
which in a way probably is even worse than the lack of democracy. Because you're living a lie in a way.
Look, Gaza has been the turning point, the litmus test, I guess, the measure for every truth or fallacy that we've been taught. And one of them is this notion of, democracy and the West being the most democratic or the most civilized, and so forth. And to have to see that, yes, where are the women's rights movements? Where are the, press? Where's the press when it comes to freedom of speech and protecting journalists and the, rules around, engaging in free press and so forth? And the list goes on. There's been a deafening silence. So it's had us as humans question the validity of that fallacy, that Western fallacy that in fact, yes, we are democratic, you are uncivilized, and we're here to teach you what is, and in fact, when we come to reflect on it, particularly in the pre-7th October of Gaza, Gaza was probably one of the freest nations, I'm talking not physical, we had air, land and sea, but freest in terms of freedom of press, freedom of opinion. Nobody was apologetic in terms of what they had to say, and there were no consequences as such as we see across, various parts of the world, including the Middle East. So Gaza has been our teacher in all of this.
How do you see this alliance? I mean, we speak of this pro-Palestine campaign, pro-Palestine movement, pro-Palestine body, if you wish. How is this, or how does this have the potential to be something long-standing? Because I don't know about you, but in my estimation, from where I come from, the worst possible scenario is for things to go back to how they were before the 7th of October. That would be the worst case scenario. I agree with you entirely that what Gaza afforded us was the chance to find friends, some old, some new, some absolutely new, and particularly re-energize and revitalize the youth. A generation which were clearly unfairly accused of being, the TikTok generation, the kind of absurdly obsessed with celebrity culture and all that, and all of a sudden we find a swell of not only support for what is right, but
leadership,
incredible creativity in terms of the kind of initiatives and projects and images and artwork of how to reach
the encampments were led. The university encampments were absolutely led by our youth.
Yeah,
and you're right.
How do we maintain this? How do we build something?
Yeah.
How do we emerge from this? Hopefully, when things have settled in Gaza and the killing has stopped, what can we point to as being the stock of this absolute devastation?
So obviously this devastation has triggered or sparked the mobilization of the grassroots in particular, of various, segments within the community. Again, whether it is students, whether it is, artists, whatever, professionals, and you name it, whether it's within our youth segment or even as adults. You've even had adults who have never been comfortable about being outspoken about Palestine and we call them the 8th of October Palestinians, and that is fine. These events have undoubtedly awakened parts of the community and allowed them to become more mobilized, to utilize their efforts towards a cause. The challenge now is to maintain that. And we've seen it time and time again. We wait for the bombs to drop on Gaza traditionally, whether it's every few years, in order for us to take to the streets and take proactive measures. But I'll tell you how things have shifted. And I can speak more from a community perspective here. So for the first time ever, you are now seeing Muslim-based charities not only collect money for humanitarian aid, which is critical, right? Our brothers and sisters abroad are in dire need of humanitarian aid and support, but they're Band-Aid solutions. So now we are thinking outside the box, and we are somewhat channeling now, or thinking about channeling some of those funds to advocacy and lobbying or litigation avenues in order to further the cause, to keep the momentum going for the cause. Because whether you like it or not, I can continue sending aid and charity to my loved ones abroad, but if we don't stop the bombs, there's absolutely no point. You're going back into that vicious cycle that we've seen for decades now. So there has been a shift, and it's about now identifying those benefits that we've seen. Again, it's very difficult to see the light through this very dark time, but there is light. And as you've pointed out, with our youth, at the very least, the generation that we so completely wrote off, have actually been at the forefront. Even when it comes to leading the protests, they're all young people. Taking initiative, whether it's the encampments, whether it's, picket lines that outside our parliamentarian offices, just camping out and making a point about something, they have been at the forefront. So now it's all about how do we maintain the momentum and, continue to allow them to remain mobilized. Because I think, I could be wrong, but I don't expect us to go back. Where we were in terms of, okay, once the bombs stop and the destruction sort of, calms down, I don't expect us. We'd be very, would be very disappointing in ourselves if we went back to where we were pre-7th of October. But I think what this has all done, it's now fueled the community. The other part of it is that the political aspect. I don't think our community, and particularly our young people, are going to be comfortable with the voting process that, say, their forefathers or fathers would otherwise have undertaken in the past, because this has been a huge slap in the face for many of us, and we're now taking ownership and leadership of our own political directions. We don't need to be led potentially by, yes, we may not be able to change the system completely. You may have been across and heard of Senator Fatima Payman,
Yes.
who crossed the floor from Labor, from within a Labor party. And the reason being is because she just could not bear it anymore. You know, her morals and ethics just could not take her being silenced or bullied into being silenced or remain quiet. And it was just too conflicting. Is she possibly going to change the entire system? Absolutely not. But again, I mean, and again, this is where we reflect on this from a sense of, a believer's sense, in that we're not focused on the result, it's the effort. You know, we put the effort when we are asked, what did you do during this time of oppression and so forth? You say, I crossed the floor. I sacrificed my job. I was prepared to take, potentially some bullying and challenges within my workplace in order to speak up.
Yeah.
And that's the risk, if you want to call it, that young people and the, varying segment within the Australian Muslim community is beginning to take, in that we're happy to take those risks.
Just finally, before we delve into the politics and the coming elections, of course, and what about the charge of anti-Semitism? How have you dealt with that? I'm sure it came your way. I'm sure it's been cited. I'm sure it's been shouted from the rooftops.
Yeah, absolutely. Everything, any there's this conflation, obviously, of anything anti-Israel is anti-Semitic. And funnily enough, I mean, the expansion of the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism has been in the works for many years. And only about 2.5 years ago, I actually attended a meeting with another colleague through APAN, the Australia-Palestine Advocacy Network, to sway and convince a key university here in Sydney to ensure that they don't adopt the definition. And for now, it hasn't. But, we are seeing, again, this is a situation now where anyone who dares speak against Israel or what it does, or anyone who, is supportive of even Israel, is going to be deemed anti-Semitic. But I think the broader community is seeing through this. I mean, I was recently labelled an anti-Israeli propagandist because, dare I, spoke about truth and facts that actually happened to me as a Palestinian from the diaspora, whereby my grandfather was literally evicted from his home in Jaffa, had to flee to Gaza and then to Egypt at the time. And I wasn't even allowed to say that. So again, this conflation of anti-Israel, anti-Semitic is becoming, it's become ridiculous to an extent that you as a Palestinian especially, you cannot even be afforded the opportunity to speak your truth and your experience. But people are prepared to see through that now. I don't think it's a situation where, we're having to accept it for what it is.
Speaking from my own perspective, one of the elements of the pro-Palestine movement, which has been absolutely unprecedented on so many levels in terms of expanse,
and consistency,
but also a consistency, but also in terms of reach, is the Jewish anti-Israel, anti-Zionist bloc. Those have been formidable. I mean, they've come out every single day. They've been absolutely formidable in terms of, and brilliant in terms of their expression of anger, their expression that Israel and the Zionist project does not represent them, does not represent their values.
We've seen that here. And in fact, there's been a formation of the Jewish Council of Australia who speaks so vocally about, their stance on the occupation, the genocide and the acknowledgement of the genocide, and that, redefining anti-Semitism, in that you being critical of Israel, you being critical of this issue to do with occupation or genocide is not anti-Semitism. We're speaking about this as Jews ourselves. It has been very heartwarming, and we need to also learn. And I think as a community, we are evolving. We've traditionally perhaps struggled at times to form allyship with various communities. and sometimes the right alliances. But I think this time round we are learning, well, all those interfaith opportunities in the past, which have been, I call them fake, right? Have been parked on the side, and now we're forming.
Fake why?
Fake in a sense where, again, there was never a conversation about Palestine during those interfaith, dialogues or conversations. And that was actually one of the rules of engagement with many and varying, scenarios around interfaith dialogue and so forth. We get along on many things, and here on a political level, when it came to securing or implementing legislative protections around religious freedoms and so forth, perfect. We formed alliances with members from the Christian community, the Jewish community and so forth. But you were never allowed to talk about Palestine because that's a point of disagreement. But now I think we've reached a point where I'm not going to sit at a table and talk to you unless you want to talk about Palestine. That's going to be my baseline.
You reminded me that 30 years ago, I feel so old now.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. I used to be part of incessant rounds of dialogues of interfaith talks. And I have to say that, I find what you say interesting because it absolutely fits with my own take. That for years, probably about 8-9 years, and traveling all across, including to the Vatican, including to many European capitals in order to meet with representatives of various churches, of the Jewish tradition, of that. I recall very, very well a conversation happening and, I telling my Jewish counterpart that, there is no area of disagreement amongst us. In fact, I could even argue that Islam and Judaism are extremely close.
Complementary.
In terms of, even rituals. And for instance, circumcision, the kind of meat that we eat and consume and various other. The problem is Palestine. The problem is Israel. And this is where we need. And it was always set as, no, this is not this is not something we're going to talk about.
Yeah.
And after a few years, I have to say that, I wouldn't have put it as strongly as you were saying fake, but I found it totally irrelevant and totally unuseful.
Yeah. Without doubt, there would have been benefits, as I've said. We were able to push forward certain critical, agendas that were relevant to the Australian Muslim community. But you asked me a question earlier about the Muslim community here in Palestine. Well, actually, I think Palestine is now the litmus test for absolutely every conversation that we have as a community. It should be at the forefront, And if you cannot even utter the word genocide, even a ceasefire initially, we couldn't get our government to even utter the word ceasefire. They would say a temporary pause or a humanitarian pause, not even utter the word. Well, that says a lot.
Yeah, we had the advent of members of, at the time, the Conservative Party in Britain, who were sacked from the party because they dared say, how about we stop, this, how about we call for a ceasefire? They were sacked. The same with then the opposition, now the government, the Labour Party, who sacked many, many officials, and many had to leave simply because they dared utter the word or suggest that maybe a ceasefire is a good idea.
Sorry, I'm not trying to reverse the situation, but to draw on that point, that's the scenario that we've got many members from within the community who are, say, involved in parties, whether it's in an employment role within the Premier's department or an MP's department, and they are sitting with this conflicting dilemma. Do I stay and knowingly that I possibly won't impart change, that I can't make change, or do I leave? And that's the question that many of our community members, there are many that are within government-based jobs. Do we stay inside and, feeling like our hands are tied, or do we walk away and possibly not be able to impart change? And that's been another dilemma.
So let's talk politics.
Yep.
You and I know that it's taken a while for Muslims particularly to be involved in politics, in real politics, being members of party, being at the front lines of party politics, being candidates who have a very good chance of winning. It's taken a long, long time for us to get here. But now you seem to be suggesting that the right thing to do is to leave, is to switch sides, rather than be in a governing party. Potentially, the argument goes that in a position where you can have authority, you can sway, you can influence, you can change, to a position which is far, far weaker from the influential and authoritative point of view. Why is that?
I mean, look, it's a very sort of ambitious, thing to think that you would be able to change the system entirely. But I think what Palestine has taught us is that you have to undoubtedly disrupt the system. And disruption comes with, I believe, taking lead and ownership at times. You've had, I know in previous elections, there was a community that was mainly comprised of the Asian community that was traditionally led by, a white person for a very long time. Not that there were any issues around that. And then suddenly, close and in the lead up to the elections, they literally had a member from within their own community parachuted into that seat, and they completely toppled that previous or their predecessor. An example such as that is actually when you are a potentially majority, Muslim seat or whatever seat, why is it that you need to be led by another? And especially when it comes to matters that particular party has been very silent and quiet on. And I think that's the shift that the Australian Muslim community is beginning to sort of to make, in that we're not going to sit back and accept maybe our forefathers, and you do, when you sit with segments of the community comprised of more of the elders, they will keep voting the same party without doubt. It's just comfortable.
Out of fear?
Possibly out of fear.
I mean, you say comfortable, but really?
Out of fear, out of loyalty. I do believe that
fear of the opposite of what's going to happen.
Yes.
If
what if the opposite sort of government?
But
comes
is that
in
not
and
legitimate? Can't you? I mean,
Absolutely.
Do you not see that point?
Absolutely, it's to to make a point that this is how much influence this community has, and we can potentially completely shift votes or swing votes in a way that you never expected. And we've got certain seats in, I'm talking New South Wales and even Victoria, you'll come to see, that are 100% safe seats, comprised of majority Muslim voters. And there is an opportunity. And I think, we've seen that in the UK. We've seen it in parts of the world now where the Muslim community, and it's not because it's a Muslim issue. We're just capitalising on the opportunity here. You have majority Muslim votes or, voters in a certain seat. Let's capitalise on this and shift things, swing it a bit, just to demonstrate what our political powers actually are. Because for far too long, as I've said, since the 1970s potentially, when my grandmother first came here, traditionally Labor, right? And you speak to any Australian Muslim, on average, they would traditionally be voting for Labor, especially those that came in the 70s and 80s and 90s. But 2023 onwards, October 2023 onwards, has changed a lot for parts of the Muslim community. And you are seeing suddenly now a rise in potential candidates that you would have never imagined, that have calibre, that have a standing and potential to take lead and not necessarily completely change the system, but disrupt it a bit, disrupt it.
How many do you viably see are going to take the payment step of deserting the party and maybe forming something else, or maybe even standing as independents? How likely is that to happen? And if it is, how many are we talking about? 2, 3, 4?
Possibly there are no more. We do have a few Muslim MPs within Parliament that sit within a Labor government, but they would not and have not taken the stance. And by the way, Fatima Payman has been the youngest senator to ever be part of a party. She's very young, and the courage, when we speak about young people, that's the courage that she's demonstrated. So in terms of anyone else crossing, I don't see that as necessary. It would have happened by now.
How do you see the next round of elections, local as well as federal? How do you see them panning out?
So there are possibly talks of the formation of a party, whether it's payment or not, and it will not be a Muslim exclusive or led party, and that's quite strategic as well. On a local level here, we have seen the push forward to have certain candidates challenge key members within key Muslim based constituencies. Whether they win or not is an unknown. The data's there, the stats are there, they look positive. But what we do need to see is we need to see the coming together of the community, first and foremost. Not only grassroots, but what we call top roots. And show support, I guess, to almost just, walk away from that traditional mindset that we've all been, and I think it's almost within that colonized mindset. When we talk about, being colonized even in and within the intellect, these are the symptoms, really. So we need to decolonize our own mindsets as a community first, in order to see a breakthrough. And I do think, look, will Liberal win? I don't think so. But we will definitely see a disruption of some sort.
One thing that I have to say I'm hesitant to address, but I have to, say that, and you please do consider this, British arrogance. And the fact that when we talk about Australia, we're talking about in itself a colonial settler project. I mean, Australia was built upon what is precisely what is going on in Israel, precisely. And Australia is just about coming to terms with its past, just about recognizing the native population of Australia and the kinds of, let's face it, the crimes, the massacres, the genocides that were committed against the natives. Is that, I fail to see how that relates to the official stand in respect to Israel. Is it that, we can't really condemn a project that is exactly like ours? Is that it? But from the other side, you've come to recognize in part your past. So is it not more sensible to forbid, the creation of that kind, so that 100 years down the line, 200 years down the line, someone else will have to stand and also recognize and... I'm in two minds here.
Absolutely. Can I give you a perfect example as to who's demonstrated this, but to a vicious extent? Germany. With their history and their, connection to, Jews and so forth, and the extent and stance in which they've taken. They haven't gone, we're pro-Jews and anti what we did. It's more so now we are anti-Palestinian. Right? They've actually taken it way too far. So if Germany's been able to take that stance, surely Australia could also, if this isn't a factor, if in that what you may be saying or proposing is that, we've got a bad history that we haven't really grappled with and actually sorted out. So how can we sort out global politics if we've got, dirty laundry in our backyard? But you can learn from that. And not that, most of today's leadership was not there at the time. And we've learned from that dark history to not repeat it. So, what side of history do you want to be on in moving forward? But I don't think that's an excuse.
I'm glad you brought up Germany, because earlier on, maybe around January, February time, I posted something which brought me a wave of anger from my German audience. I didn't know I had a German audience, but apparently I did. When I said that once again Germany is on the wrong side of history, and that brought the expected kind of reactions, unfortunately. But it's interesting on one level, but it's quite mind-boggling on another. That how is the justification? What goes into the mix of thinkings, of ideas, and especially with one's direct history, how that could correlate into another suffering that human beings are facing, and where I stand in that regard.
But sorry, it feeds into that traditional narrative of the white man versus the brown man.
Mm-hmm.
In that, and let's face it, Palestinians and in fact Arabs have been painted as alien human animals, dehumanized in a sense that's unprecedented. We've seen it, we've heard about it, but not to this extent. And I guess it's that notion, when we're talking about the Germany example, it's the same thing in that, these are the other and they are not worthy. And it's part of that colonial, brainwashing project in painting the other as less, as inferior. You are not human enough. In fact, you cannot even contextualize a Palestinian story in the same way that you would say for an Israeli. Very different. So I think it comes out of, and it's sort of, it's birthed out of that typical colonial mindset in that it is the white man versus the brown man, and the brown man will always be inferior.
Just before we leave Australian politics, a question that I think that we face and I personally take on as a challenge for everyone, and that is this system that is called democracy, that we're all engaged with, that we're all campaigning for in one way or another, but that ultimately gives us one bad choice, one worse choice. So it's in the UK where we have the two main parties. It's in America where we have, the Democrats versus Trump, and apparently in Australia we have something similar. Is there no escaping this? How on earth can we call this a democracy when ultimately the choices are so dire? How is that? What can be done?
I think as a start, taking to the stage as an independent may be an option. There are some, parties that are, you probably know about the Greens, you've heard about, so they have traditionally been very sort of they are not traditionally, they have always been vocal and outspoken about Palestine and many other elements. But
by the way, you mentioned the Greens. The Greens made great advances, as well as the Lib Dems.
Yep.
They made great advances in our elections. Any chance that might happen here?
Possibly. But it's very important to keep them, although they may never win.
Absolutely.
Yeah, but their preferences matter. Should independence be pushed forward? So I think as a start, and again, Fatima Payman is a perfect example. In that, you were sitting in a party, and by the way, it sort of allows you to question, was she that tokenistic Muslim, hijabi, the visibly Muslim, who, when she was first sort of announced or elected, it was like, so inspiring.
Yeah, we're there.
We got there. And then to be put in the back with your hands shackled, not allowed to speak to or breathe about Palestine, you realise, okay, there's something really wrong. So she took that stand. So I think as a start, I don't think we cannot lose all hope, right? And again, going back to the ethos of our beliefs and so forth, in that, you put the effort in, the result's not in our hands. What is the next best thing to do in this situation? Well, let us amplify and support, strong independents who may be able to, push the narrative or, again, disrupt the status quo. Because I think, you're not going to see revolutions happen overnight. It will take time, right? And this is just a start.
I have to say that we can't escape the fact that you come from Palestinian heritage, I come from Iraqi heritage. We are essentially Arabs. And we can't escape the fact that whilst we're criticizing, lambasting the systems that we have in either the UK or in Australia or anywhere else, that the deafening silence from the Arab world is something to, it embarrasses me. And it's something I'm constantly asked about. How do you address this?
And the worst of it is when the West tells you, well, your Arab leadership is quiet, so what's our responsibility? I think the answer to that, the way you can actually reverse engineer that is, well, you're the democracy. Why don't you lead by example, right? If you claim to be the democratic sort of civilized way, why don't you lead by example? Look, it is utterly disappointing, and particularly whether we're talking Egypt, when the border's there, whether we're talking Jordan, Saudi Arabia, the list goes on. It is absolutely disappointing, but at the same time, it's not surprising, right? Traditionally and historically speaking, all this is common. Even when it comes to freedom of speech. I mean, dare you or I speak openly about, anyone within government, within those countries or regions, you'd probably, end up locked away somewhere. So the way I see it is that I don't think we can be bogged down by that aspect, but rather, and again, we weren't put here, A, by choice, but also for no reason. We were put in these positions, in these countries for a reason, and we need to utilise these opportunities. Because I do know that there are segments within the community that are against even engaging whatsoever in the system and whatever, and I think that's counterproductive. Whether you like it or not, however much you may feel marginalised and isolated, this is my home. I was born and raised here. I do have a homeland that I'd love to freely be able to visit when I can. If I ever have the right of return, I would. But ultimately, I was born and raised here. My children are born and raised here, and I'll most likely be buried here. My grandparents are buried here. So I'm just as Australian as anyone else may claim to be. And I need to, utilise the freedoms and opportunities that I have and that we have. So the sky is your limit, right? Challenge the system in a lawful, democratic manner, nothing different. Be prepared for challenges. Be prepared to take risks, because you would not be able to even entertain these ideas. Last year, I was actually pulled aside when I went to Umrah for wearing a kufiya. Whereas every year that I go to Umrah, I've never ever been pulled aside. I'd normally have a kufiya all the time, even when I, pre-7th of October, and suddenly it became political last year. So without doubt, these have been very trying times, for particularly residents within those countries who are yearning to speak up, but they know their hands are tied. So we, in varying parts of other countries, have a responsibility to at least speak up.
Let's talk about what's likely to happen. How do you see the future of Australian Muslims, of the Australian pro-Palestine movement? How do you see that panning out? Obviously the talk will be about elections. There's going to be a lot of noise about that. There's going to be a lot of disagreement. There's going to be probably even splits within organizations, within communities. I was having conversations with young people who were saying that we are going to vote differently from our parents and it's causing them upset. So that's going to be a mark of the next few months. But looking further down the line, what do you see happening? How do you envisage? Obviously there's a hope and a wish, but no, I'd like you to think objectively in light of where we are, what's happening, the kind of discussions are being had. How do you see things panning out?
First and foremost, as a Muslim community, there's definitely been awakening. Right? I think we've been woken up, finally shaken, in a sense where, whether it's politically or faith-based, I don't think we're going to go pre-7th of October, and hoping not. So you are going to see a more confident, empowered, steadfast Australian Muslim community. We have been resilient over the years in the wake of whether it's September 11 and many other incidents. There was a Link Cafe incident and the heightened Islamophobia and anti-Palestine. We've been through all that. And, it may get worse, without doubt. But we are a resilient community. And I think that, we will lead with an intention to actually make change, if not on a global level, at least locally. That's one. Globally speaking, this is the start of something big. Right? The world will never go back. The world's perspective on Israel will never be the same after the 7th of October. They have lost, in my opinion, not just that, are they losing economically, and are they losing, through public opinion and so forth, that propaganda war that they thought, that myth that, Israel is the most moral, or the IOF, that is the most moral army, it is the most democratic country or nation and so forth. That's all a myth now. And the world has been exposed to that, I think. So if anything, if we don't see, God forbid, a liberated Palestine, a free Gaza, no occupation and apartheid, at the very least, at least we know now that we have planted the seeds that the other side thought they completely extinguished in 1948. We have just replanted a new batch of seeds to ensure that that movement towards liberation. My grandfather didn't witness liberation and freedom. My father may not, I may not, my children, maybe my grandchildren, and even if it's 10 generations, it doesn't matter. But those seeds have been planted, and I think that's where we need to focus. What are we doing in the meantime to nurture those seeds? And if that's all I have, I'm content with that.
How about BDS? How's that been?
BDS is very important. So we've seen the collapse of apartheid in South Africa through boycotts and so forth. Boycotts are really working, but we need to also be very strategic. So we need to have very targeted campaigns and boycotts where we are seeing the collapse of entities that have a direct link to the funding of illegal settlements and so forth. And again, what's been all inspiring, I'll talk on an Australian Muslim community level, is not only are they boycotting, but they are now creating and innovating alternatives. Yeah. And that's been powerful. So if that's all that we took, sadly, through the 40,000+ innocent lives that have been taken, but if that's what we've gained, that's also a positive.
And the inspiring thing is that the young, and I mean the young, I mean the 6-year-olds, the 7-year-olds, the 8-year-olds, all of a sudden have something to draw, something to tell, a story to tell, a face to, relate to. And that's definitely something for the future, something to be hopeful about.
Absolutely. There's been a newly struck connection between especially we're talking Gaza, who has, been the largest open-air prison, to suddenly, and through social media, by the way, this is the other war that Israel has lost. They lost the mainstream media war, propaganda war. And we have shown through social media that despite the blockades, despite the prison walls, we've been able to get our stories out and reach that 6-year-old on the other side of the world. And that's been very powerful.